joined today with Canadian radio host Marc Patrone out of Mississauga.
Yeah, Mississauga. And for those of you who out there, welcome. Thank you for having me on the show today, Miles. Yeah, Mississauga is just outside of Toronto, so it's part of the Greater Toronto area. We're basically like a bedroom community. We're a separate city, jurisdictional-wise, but it's just one big part of Toronto. What's going on?
So, quick question: what part of Canada are you from originally?
Toronto. This is it. I mean, I was born in North York, which is also just basically north of Toronto, and lived there for most of my life. And then I left to go to Eastern Canada, where I worked for Canadian CTV, and I was there for years. Moved around. I bounced around. I lived in Ottawa for a while, which is the capital of Canada. Then I moved out west to Calgary, lived there for a while, and then moved back here. So basically, I've just kind of followed where the work took me, Miles, and I've always kind of been like that.
And so now, at one point, didn't you serve as is it a chair?
Yeah, the CRTC. That's right. No, it's I was not the chairman, but I was a commissioner of what we call the CRTC, which is basically your equivalent of the FCC, federal. What would your communications commission, right? The Federal Communications Commission.
Yep.
Your regulator for broadcasters and telecommunications companies in that industry in the United States. So we have the equivalent up here. It's called the Canadian Radio, Television, Telecommunications Commission. So I sat on that commission for 5 years.
Okay, so for anybody who doesn't know, I've been on your show probably a couple dozen times, starting about 2 years ago, actually, or about a year and a half ago. And before we get into, the Trump and all that politics, there's two things I wanted to talk about. One of which was there was an interesting story I saw you reporting on once, which was at one point there was a flood in Canada and the government rounded up citizens' guns. This is correct?
Yeah, this was in the province of Alberta, which is the western part of Canada. If you look at Montana and go straight north, you'll be in Alberta, and it's a huge land mass. A couple of bigger cities like Edmonton and Calgary, and it's got some smaller cities as well, like Lethbridge and Red Deer and so forth. And so there was an area not too far from Calgary called High River, ironically. So that area flooded, and what happened was people were forced out of their homes to flee to safety, which was the smart thing to do. And then the cops, what we call the RCMP, the Mounties, they're pretty famous, so I'm sure you've heard of them down there. They decided to take it upon themselves to go into people's homes and basically confiscate firearms just because they felt like it or thought that they could. So this is an example where in the midst of a crisis, the government or the cops, all of a sudden they morph into tyrants. They sort of, start channeling their inner Gestapo and start treating people as if they are, under the thumb of the state, whether it's a constitutional republic like yours or what we have up here, which is a parliamentary system. But either way, the cops just decide, oh, well, here's a perfect opportunity to seize firearms just because we can. And that's what they did. And so some media went after them. I mean, conservative media. I was working for something called the Sun News Network at the time. We reported on that and exposed it for what it was, which was a gun grab and a power grab by the part of police. Had no reason to do what they did. They said it was a safety thing, but they just did it because I thought, they could get away with it, and they can't get away with it. But unfortunately, it's just one of those examples where anytime you have a crisis, you have bodies in authority that normally are supposed to be serving the people that all of a sudden decide, yeah, we're going to become, your overseer. We're going to become tyrants, and we're going to just seize power. And that's really all it takes. And, whether it's COVID or floods or whatever excuse they can, it just seems that these people just suddenly morph into something ugly and tyrannical when they have a reason to do so.
Yeah, when I came across the news story, it just instantly reminded me of what happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. A very similar thing where the police, I think it was actually the National Guard, went to these houses, far outside the city, out in the country, and rounded up people's guns. And it's like, well, they're off in their homes, outside the city. If anything, they're just looking to protect their own home, and the military went around and rounded up their guns. So was that under this? Was this pre Justin Trudeau?
Yes, that was during Harper's time. Stephen Harper is a former Prime Minister of Canada. He was defeated in 2015 by Justin Trudeau and the Liberals. They came into power then, and this happened in around I want to say 2013, 14, around there. Yeah, not good.
So,
yeah, and it happens. It's happened in the United States. So you raise an excellent point about Hurricane Katrina. It's when people are most vulnerable, right? That's when the cops and the government becomes more tyrannical. Is when the people are down and they need help. They're vulnerable, and the government, rather than helping, goes in there and confiscates firearms.
Well, of course, there's the famous quote by Rahm Emanuel, the former Chicago mayor, that he said, I think before he worked in the Obama administration, and his quote was, "Well, you never miss out on the chance to you never miss out on the opportunity to use a crisis for your own advantage." To paraphrase
exactly.
it.
Never let a crisis go to waste. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much the mantra. It's not only the left, though. I think it's some people. In both parties, I think Republicans. There are some Republicans that seem to think it's perfectly fine these days. So yeah,
it's definitely something with both sides. So I'm doing this podcast piece, and I'm going to be talking about the 1980s. You're going over both the music and the major events of the 1980s. Well, first off, as far as music, what would you say were some of the greatest musical groups music made in the 80s?
Wow. Well, I mean, Guns N' Roses came out with Appetite for Destruction. I mean, that was sort of one of those seminal records, maybe one of the greatest debut albums in history. Hugely popular and remains a staple on classic rock radio. But you also had artists like in the pop realm, like Madonna, for instance. Prince was huge. Michael Jackson. Brothers in Arms came out with Mark Knopfler and Dire Straits. That was another huge album when CDs were coming in. And so those were some of the bands that were dominating the landscape at the time. And out of Britain, you had sort of the new wave, kind of new romantic sounds, Spandau Ballet and bands like that. We used to listen to a lot of that stuff back in the day. So dance music, it was the disco. This was sort of the post-disco type of era. So you had sort of more organic sounding disco music, like Chic, for instance, in the late 70s. And then in the 80s, it sort of morphed into more electronic type music, like New Order, and bands like that became huge in the dance areas and the discos. And so those were types of records that came out that were huge at the time. But there was a lot of great music that came out in the 80s.
And now, being in Canada, maybe it was a little bit, maybe the Cold War is a little different, but I mean, I guess anywhere you lived in the world, the Cold War was a serious thing. Looking back on the 1980s, and I mean, basically, we had Ronald Reagan, and then in '88 we got Vice President Bush became president. It was Trudeau's father prime minister in the 80s.
Okay, well, what happened was Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was the prime minister early on in the 80s, so the first few years. But that was the end of the Trudeau era, the first Trudeau era. What came in after that in 1984, Brian Mulroney was one, perhaps the biggest, or maybe the second biggest, depends on who you ask, majority in. It was a massive victory for the Conservatives in 1984, and so he's what they used to call the progressive Conservative prime minister, and so he was certainly to the right of a guy like Pierre Trudeau and the Liberals. So he did move the needle conservatively somewhat, not enough for some people's liking, but he was certainly a big friend, a major friend of Reagan at the time. And the two of them, they would get together and have sort of this Irish kind of summit, and you sing When Irish Eyes are Smiling and the rest of it. So they had a good time. They had a very good rapport, a very good relationship. And Mulroney was able to get some agreement from the United States on acid rain at the time was a big issue. And so they were able to reach that. And then the other thing that Mulroney pushed a little later on was the free trade agreement. So you had NAFTA at the time, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and it began between Mulroney and Reagan. They got together, their staffs got together, administrations, and said, well, how do we make this work? How do we reduce the regulations between our two countries in order to make things better for jobs on both sides, and we don't have to bother with so much red tape, and we can both grow and we can both improve our economies. And so they struck this deal, and then there was another election in 1988, which Mulroney won again, and which basically sealed the deal in terms of this agreement, this NAFTA agreement between Canada, the United States, and then Mexico came along. So they had an excellent relationship, but they also had a lot of agreement in terms of forming an alliance against what was then the Soviet bloc. Okay, so at that time you had Soviet Russia and a host of satellite nations which were very much under the thumb of Moscow at the time, countries like Romania and Czechoslovakia before that splintered. You had East Germany, and let's see if I can name them all here. I know Hungary. There was little countries as well that were kind of part of Russia and kind of not, like Latvia and those sorts of countries like that, Estonia. And so you had all those countries and forming that bloc in the East. You had China off doing kind of its own things because, we thought of them as part of the communist bloc, but they were as much at odds with Soviet Russia as almost we were, because they would have border skirmishes and border issues and sort of thing, and so neither of them trusted each other. And so at the time you had Mulroney and Reagan, and of course you had Thatcher in the UK, who was a conservative, and you also had, I believe it was Helmut Kohl in what was then West Germany. And so between those leaders, you had this solid foundation of opposition to the Soviets. And so Reagan really did some things which led to the end of the Soviet bloc. And it was that opposition, that refusal to appease to the Soviet bloc, and basically outspending the Soviets. But there were other aspects to the fall of the Soviet Union towards the end of that decade. And Reagan was key to helping make that happen. And so that led to the fall of the Soviet bloc and a movement into more of what we have today. And what happened in the early 90s under Clinton was and Chrétien up here, who was prime minister at the time, was bringing China into the World Trade Organization. And so that turned out to be a fateful decision, one which I dare say was a terrible idea. I mean, at the time, some of the reasoning was, well, we'll let China in, and over time, they'll become more like a liberal democracy. but it was a stupid idea because all it did was made them rich, or made them richer anyway. It strengthened their economy immeasurably. They sort of took on some trappings of capitalism without the freedom side, but became as totalitarian as ever. And so they continued to get richer. They built up their military. And so that led to what we have today, which is presumably what you wanted to discuss, which is, Cold War Part Two. In this case, it's China, and it's the West, and Russia has again this kind of uneasy relationship with China, but they just recently signed a tens of billions of dollars worth of trade deal between those two countries, and so basically Russia is feeding China the energy it needs in order to continue building, and so China now has a steady, reliable source of energy, whether it's natural gas or oil, from Russia. And in exchange, Russia, of course, gets much needed currency in order to keep and prop up its economy, which is much smaller than China's right now. And so that's what we're looking at now. And then China has done a fantastic job of infiltrating many of the institutions, of stealing intellectual property from the United States, from Canada, and other Western countries. They've done a phenomenal job of paying off bureaucrats, paying off politicians, bribing people, and blackmailing people. I mean, we all know about the Biden laptop situation. It's nice to see Hunter coming out admitting finally, well, yes, that could be my laptop. Yeah, maybe that story in the New York Post wasn't such a piece of fake news after all. And Twitter coming out, yeah, it's okay, I'm rubbing their face in it as much as I can. Oh, it's a story now, is it? But that's really what we face now. And China is a much more serious and dangerous foe than I think the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had, of course, the nukes. And so they could, of course, there was always that. But China has been much better at infiltrating, undermining, for instance, buying up huge chunks of Hollywood and the media, of course, and politicians, which now are pretty much in the pocket of China. I mean, politicians go over there and fall into honeypot situations where they end up, in bed with Chinese prostitutes in hotels. China has been doing this for years, and through these activities has been very successful in compromising many of our institutions in this country. And we're in a real battle with these people to save the freedoms that we have.
Well, so skipping forward past the 80s and everything, and talking more about the politics of the last 5 years, I think if you had been asked, could Trump be president 10 years ago, I almost feel like it would be easy to believe that he was president before he was so controversial, and then when he started running, it was hard to believe that he would actually be elected for many people. Do you think part of the reason that Trump got elected was the cancel culture that was already going on at that time, the censorship and so forth?
Trump spoke in a way that people understood. People were waiting to hear from somebody who was plain spoken, said the kind of things that people have been thinking. And so that's why he got in. That's why Jeb, for all the money he spent on his campaign, was a complete dud. And so you had the Republican establishment backing all these other candidates, and they all fell flat on their face because at the end of the day, the grassroots Republican community listened to this guy, Trump, and they said, well, yeah, he may be bombastic and, this New Yorker, this guy from Queens, kind of rough around the edges, but he talks kind of like me, and he sounds like me, and he's saying things that I agree with, like NAFTA sucks. So we had to, that our trade deals with these countries like Canada and Mexico have made us poorer. And by the way, why are we shipping so many jobs to China? Why is that a good thing? Why should that continue? And so China talked about renegotiating these deals. And that resonated with a lot of people, a lot of blue collar Americans, many of whom in the Rust Belt states would have voted Democrat. This time they were listening to a guy like Trump who'd say, hey, this guy is going to bring back jobs, is going to bring back the steel industry. What did you have from Obama? Obama's saying, well, those jobs aren't coming back. And what's this guy Trump talking about? What's he going to wave a magic wand and bring those jobs back? But Trump was saying, no, I've got a plan, and I'm going to show you how it's done. Just give me a chance. And people gave him a chance. And that's why he got in, because he spoke in a way that people understood. And by that point, I imagine that a lot of Americans were sick of the BS they were getting from the Republican Party and George Bush's wars. They didn't want to go back to that. And so Trump promised something that was a little different. And they sensed that this guy was an independent, that this guy was a maverick, that he wasn't going to fall under the thumb of the usual establishment Republican, who push a certain agenda, like open borders and, never-ending wars, all these things. Trump was different, and he promised different things, and they gave him a chance, and Trump came through despite enormous amounts of opposition. Trump did a lot of what he said he would accomplish, and I think he was a successful president in many respects.
I mean, I have my, disagreements with Trump, but I'm not going to deny, the areas where I do agree with him or did agree with him on things. It does seem that he was far less militaristic than most presidents. I mean, he did talk about the military industrial complex, which I don't think we've had a president talk about that in about 70, 60, 70 years.
Yeah, since Eisenhower.
Yeah. And he, I recently, it was I want to say 18-year anniversary of the Iraq War last month. And I looked up how many troops do we have in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was shocked that the number is actually down to about 2,500. I just realized I have to grab a charger. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Trump and the wars overseas, he did actually get a lot of troops out. He, in some ways, tried to stop our intervention in Syria. And then what was the first thing that Biden did? But sending troops, I want to say sending troops back into Syria or doing a bombing campaign in Syria his first week in office.
Yeah, I guess he's got to make up for lost time. I mean, the Democrats wanted war, and there hasn't been. Trump did not start any war. He was the first president in decades to not do that. And so, obviously, with the Democrats coming in, very much under the thumb of the military-industrial people, the complex. I mean, they want war. It's a society. I mean, you're talking about $1 trillion industry here, with the likes of Lockheed Martin and the rest of them. I mean, they're making these weapons, man. You better use them. And if it costs blood and treasure, then so be it. That's what it's got to take. Yeah.
But now, I mean, I'm trying to think of all this different picks that he put into his administration. I mean, what's somebody that you would have, going back, told him not to do?
Well, I don't know what Janet Yellen is doing in Treasury. I mean, here was this extremely dovish individual when she was at the Fed. And just the massive money printing, of course. I mean, what we're starting to see an erosion in the U.S. dollar. We've been talking about this stuff for decades. A lot of the gold bugs have been talking about this. People like Harry Dent have been talking about it. I mean, eventually, you can't print forever. I mean, they don't really necessarily print it now. They just kind of press a few keystrokes on a computer and create trillions of dollars out of thin air. I mean, eventually, your currency is going to start to get degraded. And so there's certain games you can play, like manipulate the price of gold, for instance, in order to try and maintain this facade that the dollar is worth more than it is at the greenback. But it's already starting to erode, and you're seeing more and more pushes, a greater push by the Chinese, for instance, the Russians. All these countries have been accumulating more gold over the years, but they want to move away from the greenback more and more. In fact, I read that at the moment, a good chunk of the world is basically moving away from the U.S. dollar in terms of its reserve currency status. And that, I mean, Americans need to understand what a monumental move that would be, because once that starts to happen and pick up steam, then America can't just print dollars out of thin air anymore and expect that it's going to be worth what it was, say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago or at any time in the past. You will hyperinflate at some point. It has to happen. It's just a law of economics. And I mean, I'm not saying you're going to turn into Zimbabwe overnight or Venezuela. I think they just printed off a trillion bolivar note in Venezuela. I don't know how many trillions of dollars you need to buy a loaf of bread in Caracas these days, a trillion bolivars. But you don't want to get any further down the road of degrading the currency of the United States. And so Yellen kind of feeds into that same mindset. So I would certainly have questioned her appointment, but she's a Democrat. She's a loyal Democrat. She's going to play by the rules, and she's certainly well connected with Goldman and the rest of it. And so, I could see why they brought her in, but I mean, in terms of economic policy, I don't see that she's going to help the United States all that much.
I mean, I haven't, I think with everybody, I think we can always find one issue we probably disagreed with them on. I mean, what would you say was the best and worst thing you saw about President Trump?
The best, okay, I'll say that he pushed back against the deep state. And I know a lot of people don't think there is a deep state or conspiracy theory time, all this kind of crap. There's a deep state. And so he pushed back to the degree that he could. Unfortunately, he was kind of naive. And so he kept a lot of the backstabbers in previous, like the Bush crowd, a lot of them were still in there. They were working against him all along. He was warned that was the case. But, he tried to bring in people like Flynn and so forth, but they were immediately targeted and taken out. And so to the degree that he tried to extricate government from the tentacles of these bureaucrats, these longstanding deep staters, I think was a positive. The economic gains that he made, though, I think stand head and shoulders over anything that we've seen a president do since Reagan. If you're talking about renegotiating agreements with Canada, with Mexico, and repatriating jobs from China, that's really one reason why China was so fearful of Trump, because they saw how successful he was in bringing back industry through the policies of deregulation, and so getting rid of this massive web of regulation allowed industry to shine once again. And so he brought back a lot of industry. And what did we see? Jobs. We saw amazing increase in jobs, especially, in amongst communities that had suffered in the past. The African American community. Record numbers of job creation amongst Blacks in America and Latinos. Those were the people who really were gaining. And I think that the Democrat Party had become so panicked at the prospect of having these communities that they were able to, fearmonger their way into massive majorities election after election. Well, they couldn't do that anymore because Trump was pointing to success and saying, look, these people don't need the state to babysit them. They need jobs. They need careers. They need hope. They need to be able to create their own economic benefits. And Trump made that happen. So he did a fantastic job in turning around the economy in the United States. And the wall, I think, was a good idea. Some people think, no, it was terrible. But now we're seeing, the fact that it was unfinished, major tragedy. What have you got in your border right now? You've got a disaster area. You've got kids in cages, right? You've got thousands of people approaching cross caravans full of people. You didn't have that when Trump was there, did you? Well, you do now. I mean, so all these people who voted for Biden who thought, yeah, he's going to take care of us, on the COVID front. Well, what have you got? You've got people coming in with COVID, right, crossing the Mexican border, not even being checked. They're just going right in. I mean, I mean, the worst thing I think from Trump's vantage point, I think his naivete. I would have certainly liked to have seen him being a lot less trustful in terms of big tech. He should have gone over there. He should have taken away those exemptions that they had, and earlier. Unfortunately, he got tied up with Russia collusion, and they threw enough things at him to kind of distract him and to prevent him from pushing through with an agenda, which I think would have been pro-Americana in the extreme. And so, unfortunately, we didn't see the crackdown on big tech that we should have seen. But it's a minor, a relatively minor point, and I have to say that it's only because Trump, I think, was either too naive about these people, about the opposition, the huge opposition that was aligned against him, and so he trusted people that he shouldn't have trusted. I think he trusted big tech like Twitter. He made Twitter. I mean, from the time he took over, with millions and millions of hits to Twitter, Twitter grew exponentially because of Trump. And so, how did they reward him? By screwing him over during the campaign when they stopped the sharing of that Hunter Biden story. And we saw later on polls saying, "Well, I didn't know about the Hunter Biden laptop story. That might have changed my opinion about how I would have voted." Well, that was big tech very much working hand in hand with the Democrats to squelch negative stories about the Democrats. And so, unfortunately, it would have been great to have cracked down on big tech, Google, Twitter, and Facebook, and these people. That didn't happen. So that would be the downside.
So now talking about the Biden administration, and there's so much to talk about it. First off, do you think the Democrats will lose the House and Senate in 2022?
Well, not if they can rig it like they did the presidential election. I mean, so this will get you deplatformed. But I mean, look, I gotta say, I mean, there's no way Biden got 81 million votes. I don't believe it. But I mean, you would expect that they would lose the Senate and the House. They almost lost the House last time. I mean, the Democrats or the Republicans flipped. I can't remember. Was it 15 seats? Somewhere between 15 and 20 seats. They held on to all the seats that were kind of toss-ups, flip of the coin type of deal. And a lot of those House wins were due to Trump, support for Trump. And so this is why it's so bizarre that he lost the election. Here he is with the massive coattails that allowed so many House seats to be flipped from blue to red, and yet he loses the presidential bid. That didn't make any sense to me. And so I would fully expect, I mean, if as long as the election is run fairly, then yeah, I would expect that that the House will flip. I would hope that it flips. I mean, I think there's a lot of Democrats that are in trouble. And I see now Biden offering a job to Joe Manchin's wife. I guess you got to try to keep him in line. I suppose that's one way to try and keep Joe from siding with the Republicans on some of these. Because it's how they won those 2 seats in Georgia is still beyond me. I mean, it's just flabbergasting. But I guess they did. I mean, so yeah, I would expect so. But these days, and sadly, because it seems that the elections have been through mail-in ballots mainly have been compromised, then they have to get. I'm glad that Georgia passed that bill. I mean, it's in a way it's a dollar short, but at least they did the action that did. And how have people responded to that bill and passing in Georgia? They pulled out the Major League Baseball All-Star game, out of Atlanta. I mean, that's insane. Just because Kemp decided to do something about what was clearly an issue around elections. And so the United States is fracturing more and more between states that want to hold on to their constitutional rights and freedoms and states that are willing to stay in lockdown and become more and more corrupt. And I think that's sadly where the fractures are happening. So,
I mean, I don't exactly take a position on the election fraud question because I just haven't seen enough to really sway my opinion on it. And I looked at the year 2000. I thought there was fraud in 2000. I thought there was fraud in 2004. I've seen state elections here in Wisconsin that were very questionable. I think with one of them, with Scott Walker winning, there was this question about some of the votes being counted out of state. There was also the one where there was a Supreme Court race where one candidate won by 251 votes, and the next day they find a ripped bag of ballots with like 4,000. And so I think that, I think election fraud is always possible. Whether it's enough to flip an election one way or another is another question. But I do think it's amazing, this idea where all the Democrats who, 4 years ago, they go, oh, the election was rigged. The election was rigged by Russia. And it's like, how? Well, oh, there were these memes, you see. And it's like, what? There are memes? Like that's their, they acted like 2016 was rigged. And now 4 years later, they act like it's so impossible and that it's such an offensive idea to say that there could have been any rigging. But
well, look, I mean, why stop the election? Why stop the counting in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and Georgia and Arizona? I mean, why did that happen? I mean, don't you just count the votes until there's no more votes to count and then, declare a winner? No, they didn't do that. They stopped it for whatever reason. And then you had videos of white vans showing up in the middle of the night with presumably with ballots. And we saw the video in Georgia. I forget which county it was, but where you had, after the votes had supposedly stopped counting, all of the scrutineers had left, the media had left, then you had people in there continuing to count, pulling cases full of ballots from underneath the table. Oh, look, and they continue to run the same ballots over and over again. I mean, that was an absolute, and that was on security video. People saw that. And that happened, I suspect it happened in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin and Michigan. Yeah, you're right in saying that there's always been fraud. That's true. You've always had dead people voting. You've always had these issues, but never to the degree that you had in 2020. It's not, that was beyond the pale. That was unbelievable what happened. And that was, sadly, the United States has been mocked now because, when you look at the campaign that Biden ran, the basement campaign, even today, they have to maintain this fraud that he's this popular guy. So what does YouTube do? They get rid of all these dislikes, literally hundreds of thousands of dislikes. People can't stand Biden because they know he's a fraud. So what happens? He posts a video, few people watch, and those that do say, this sucks. Biden sucks. so YouTube covers for him by deleting all these negative comments and downvotes. And so you're living in this kind of matrix where you've got big tech and the media trying to push this meme, trying to push this narrative that Biden is this popular guy and a legitimate president. Nobody believes it. Nobody does. And it's a tragedy because look at him now. There's nothing left of the guy. He doesn't know his own name half the time. Doesn't know where he is. He's introducing members of cabinet, forgets their names, forget what building he's in. The guy he's in rough shape, man. Seriously rough shape.
I was watching that press conference he did, and I was kind of amazed. It seemed like half the journalists had written down the same exact question before they got there, and then once one of them had asked it, the rest of them just tried to rephrase the same exact question because half of it was just the border, the border, the border, the border, and and there was one guy who asked about the amount of troops in Afghanistan and then whether we were going to be getting out of Afghanistan by the deadline. But it seemed like it was just weird. It was almost as if the media was like jumping to the left of Biden on the border issue and trying to just use their platform as a journalist to push an agenda. They know
that Kamala's waiting in the wings, and she's probably to the left of Biden. I mean, they know that he's done, and so they know that it's only a matter of time before she steps in, and she's just an Obama puppet anyway. So
And
it's sad. What has happened in the United States is really, it's tragic. It really is.
well, I mean, what do you think about how would you define the agenda going on right now with the Biden administration? I mean, it seems like,
Oh, it's
for instance,
Obama on steroids. He's doing all the things that Obama didn't have the guts to do. The gun grab. So they're going to go after firearms. It's wide open border time. So Obama was criticized by his handlers for not being radical enough. But I think he was afraid. But now with Biden in there, he can kind of lurk in the shadows and say, yeah, go for it, Joe. Yeah, do this, do that. Go after the guns. So that's what's going on now. And it's you're just going to see continuing to see the same destructive policies that you had during Obama's time. It was the slowest economic recovery in history in many decades during Obama. Obama should have had a real bounce back, powerful economy after the 2008, but instead it was kind of this lumbering, slow, lurching recovery. It was only Trump who came in there, and then he really got the ball rolling. His recovery was what Obama should have had if he had imposed policies that weren't running against industry and against the ability of a free market system to do well. And so it's or Obama on estrogen. So you're seeing all these weirdo policies, all this focus on climate change. You've had a $1.9 trillion stimulus package, and then you're going to have another $2 trillion going into infrastructure. Yeah, so that's what I mean. That's going to go into brand spanking new bridges, is it?
It's going to go into, I'm sure, a lot of policy groups who are going to be paying their lobbyists hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and they'll probably have college interns raising more money and getting paid less than minimum wage.
Yeah, it's theft, is what it is. It's theft from the middle class. Americans are being robbed by these people. So they're being robbed. They're being stripped of their freedoms. They're being stripped of their wealth, being robbed because now taxes are going to go up. And what's Biden saying? Oh, we're going to go after the rich. No, you're gonna kill the middle class, which I suspect is really, it's an attack on ordinary Americans. Americans are going to be punished now for having the temerity to vote for Trump. And so these guys are doing all the things that they would have done, had Hillary won. So now they're trying to make up for lost time, destroying the country in a bunch of different ways. Trillions and trillions in added debt. The money, the massive, mind-boggling creation of money, of fiat currency. Killing jobs through regulation, and now you're going to have this Green New Deal, which is a disaster, an absolute disaster. You already killed Keystone XL. That cost 52,000 jobs right off the first day on the job. Poof, gone, bam. See you later. You're out of work. Is this honestly is that your idea of good government? I mean, and so they're going right back to the days where you can't frack on federal lands. The only place you can do it now is on privately held lands. So he's destroying he's in the first couple of weeks, he moved the United States from being energy independent to being dependent again on what? On Saudi oil? You like being dependent on oil from the Gulf? I mean,
isn't it that he canceled the Keystone pipeline, but then another pipeline in Afghanistan is then going to go forward. So it reminds me of when the Obama administration was shutting down, I want to say, coal power plants, but he also had the Secretary of Education was from, I want to say, General Electric. And so really it wasn't done for environmental reasons. It was for, they have this way of hurting specific specific energy companies to profit other energy companies, and it can come off as looking like environmentally friendly, but really it's about profit and so forth.
Warren Buffett, a huge owner of railway systems. So now what? You got to truck oil from, using rail? Like that's more environmentally sound than pipelines? That's pretty stupid, isn't it? And becoming, how is moving oil from the Gulf to the United States more environmentally friendly than building pipelines, from Canada? How you justify something like that, so you're buying more oil from reprobate human rights abusers like Nigeria and countries like that, rather than buying it from Canada, so you kill that pipeline. Now you're talking about killing, like Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan's talking about killing another pipeline that's currently moving oil into Ontario. I mean, the province that I'm in, could suffer if that happens in a month's time or so. That could be an absolute disaster because we're relying on that energy to feed, Toronto and big cities like that. And just because it happens to go through part of Michigan, she wants to have it stopped on environmental grounds. She's a nut. Gretchen Whitmer is a head case. She is batshit fucking, sorry, but crazy.
You can swear. It's okay.
I'm sorry, but that woman is, you look in her eyes, there's something not right there. This woman is like, she's a demon. I'm sorry for my language.
It's okay.
She is.
Last question, and as far as the bigger cultural debate, with the woke college kids, and well, they're not even all in college, but the angry cancel culture. I mean, how is it different in up there in Canada? I mean, do you have any Republican mayors anywhere, or is it all Democrats that run the cities?
Yeah, I just say, like, when Bill Maher is getting to the point of calling those people crazy, you got a problem.
Yeah.
We don't have sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, just, and that was something I was going to bring up. For the record, I absolutely despise Bill Maher. I think he's such a piece of crap. But I listen to him and I agree with him. And it's like, I am so sick of agreeing with this guy because he's like one of the only people talking about how this cancel culture is going far beyond insanity. And it's like, I don't want to agree with this guy. I want to be able to disagree with this guy because he believes in horrific things. I mean, the guy once said that the war in Vietnam was a good thing because it showed how far we were willing to go to stop communism. I mean, he just says this stuff that I totally disagree with. But then he talks about freedom of speech, and he's better on that issue. But yeah. As far as Canada and the woke culture, there is it much any different?
Well, as far as Bill Maher is part of the left wing infrastructure, if you want to call it, that enables this woke thing to happen. Okay, so he can crap all over it, but he's part of the cultural mainstream that encouraged it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, he probably doesn't want to take the blame for it, but if you're a liberal in the United States, for you to then come out and crap on the woke, to me it seems like, well, you guys are the people who threw kerosene on that fire and turned it into an inferno. So why don't you look yourself in the mirror, Bill Maher? Just as far as being up here, yeah, we got the same issues up here, certain communities. I mean, I don't think it's quite as radical nut job as the kind of stuff that you've seen down there, like in Berkeley and some of these other areas. But I mean, if you're in Ottawa, for instance, and you're a pro-lifer and you want to go to a university and hand out literature, I mean, you're going to be definitely confronted by people who say, hey, you're not where you need to be. You need to go. So they're going to be attacked for sure. We also have the anti-Israeli apartheid types, those people there, pro-Palestinian, that in the extreme, whereby they refer to Israel as an apartheid state. We have those people here as well. So yeah, it's definitely pretty woke. It's pretty woke, and And so, yeah, we do have that up here. Is it as bad as it is down there? I want to say no for some reason. And
No,
there is,
I think we probably take the cake on that one. I know the most recent story I learned about in Madison was that they were having a virtual town hall or city council meeting, and this woman goes up to speak, and they don't even know if this person actually muttered it or not, but it sounded like somebody muttered the C word, and
yeah,
then they later then said that, oh, it must have been the conservative on the city council, even though there's no proof that it was him. And so they really tried to use that in the city alder race that's actually going to be going on next week. And this, I swear, the city then said, we're going to spend $10,000 to investigate who said the C word. And it's like, you've got homeless people on the street. You've got people who need shelters. You got people who need, drug rehabilitation. You've got businesses that have been rioted and looted and have broken, they've had to replace their windows and probably will have to replace their windows again soon if another riot happens. And rather than any of those serious issues, we're going to spend $10,000 investigating, which if you don't know, you're not going to figure it out. There's no way to investigate who said the C word. But they're going to drop 10 grand on a swear word.
yeah, and I'm not surprised. They're all trying to out woke each other. And they look incredibly stupid. But I tell you, I am particularly incensed by what's happened to Hollywood. I mean, if you're on Amazon Prime or Netflix, I mean, have you ever watched like their productions? It's like you gotta have. They've destroyed action movies in which men, white guys, are the heroes. You've got to have a white male who has to be the villain no matter what, and you've got to have, like, look what's that in advertising. I mean, you got to have a mixed race couple, or else it's not right. So you could take that to extreme. So you have a family in which, you've got a son who's Muslim and maybe a daughter who's who's an obviously looks like a lesbian, and then maybe you throw in an Aboriginal person, like a Cree, or whatever. I mean, you got to mix it up, and so every couple. Even Biden made a reference to it. Oh, isn't it great? But I mean, it's a little extreme, don't you? I mean, you've got to reflect society in general. But they've destroyed cinema. American cinema has now been crushed by wokeness and by political correctness, and so
no greater example than the most recent Terminator Dark Fate movie, which spoiler, they killed John Connor off in the first like 30 seconds of the movie, and then it's all about women. It's about Sarah Connor, and now there's this girl, and we did a podcast on it a couple weeks ago. They literally go to the point where the evil robot from the future comes into the movie, and I swear, he takes the form of a Mexican border agent. And and I mean the best part. I mean, this movie was so bad. Eventually, they find Arnold Schwarzenegger, which because the young Arnold robot came back in the '90s and killed John Connor, and now he's living in Texas. He's an old man, and he's married and to a woman who apparently doesn't have sex with, as he explains. And what does he do? He has a job lives in Texas, and he works as, I swear, a drape salesman. I mean, they were like, they took Terminator and they were like, we are going to make this the most woke movie. And plus, this, the movie came out 2 years ago, so whatever, 2019, I guess, at the height of some of that stuff. The thing about Canada that I never got, Jordan Peterson, I just don't get what made him so controversial. But it's like he's a professor who has different views. Like that used to be how universities were. There were some professors that were here and there, and he's not even necessarily that conservative. He just has some different viewpoints and some issues, and they made him out to be the devil. And it's like, I'm not necessarily really into his work. I've listened to it. I mean, it's seems like you know, doesn't seem like anything that controversial or crazy, and they made him
Yeah.
out to be like he was Hitler or something.
Well, if you preach self-reliance, then you're going to run counter to the woke crowd, which wants to turn everybody into victims. Unless, of course, you're like me, and you're a white dude, in which case, yeah, okay, you're Satan. But no, what he was saying was, before you saw social justice warriors, rather than going out to try and change the world by destroying property, why don't you clean up your own room? And while apparently that's really outrageous, in the minds of some people, because to them it's all about what a victim you are, so this is one group victimizing another, and so the left has to balance the scales. That's where they get to play what they, in their mind, they have this God complex, so they're going to fix it all. And so he's not playing along. So people come up to say, "Oh, what about climate change?" And he say, "Well, yeah, what about climate change? Are you going to give up your car? Or are you going to give up? Like, we live in a pretty cold, the coldest country on the face of the earth. We live in it. You're going to stop heating your home. You could turn, so no more electric heat. No more oil heat. It's like, excuse me. And so nobody wants to give anything up, but they want to they want a virtue signal about how they're all into climate change and, what a threat it is. So up here they say it's a climate emergency. It's gone from being, a problem and an issue to now it's an emergency. Like, call 911. The climate is changing. I'm actually thinking of doing a skit on that. Calling 911. What is your emergency? Climate. Climate is an emergency. It's changing. You'd be arrested, and justifiably so, because you'd be seen as crazy. Well, we got like cabinet ministers up here. We're spouting this crap day in, day out.
Well,
And sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I have my environmental. I have my environmental concerns, and I would say, probably the best way to address it is that, you need to help companies that, or not even help them, just let them produce clean energies, let the free market, as far as some of these companies go, probably stop giving so much, subsidies to these oil companies. But the Green New Deal is absolutely insane because it includes union. And it's like, well, the biggest unions in the United States are actually some of the biggest polluters. And I would say AOC's, Green New Deal was a ripoff of Jill Stein's Green New Deal. And I could go off about that forever. But I got to wrap up soon. So Marc, thank you very much. You have the radio station or the radio show.
Talk 60. That's right. I mean, it's. I mean, for your viewers, listeners, they probably get us online. So SAUGA Saga 960am.ca. And you could look for my show, and you can listen to the podcast or stream us live if you like.
And also, of course, Marc Patrone on Twitter.
At Marc Patrone. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
great talking to you today. Appreciate that, Miles.
Thank you for being on.